Going to do today, and for you all. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I am just absolutely delighted. Enough about me, though. We can talk. You have enough about me in your leaflet. I've got plenty more to say throughout the day, but I really want to get down to the heart of why we're here today, which is to think about creating a rule of life. Now, for our prayer this morning, we started with this walk to the future, this being able to see a little glimpse of the icon of where God might be sitting us. Why this is important to start, if you wanted to write down what you saw, please feel free to do so. The reason for forming a rule of life, which is a guidepost for us, if you will, almost like a trellis that we can grow up, is so that we can indeed grow into the person that God has created us to be. I do not know a single person who has ever said to me that they would like to do nothing with their life. I don't imagine anybody here is that way either. Right? We all hope to live a life not only that has meaning and purpose, but for those of us who are followers of Jesus, we want to live a life that gives back to God, that shows forth God's glory, and helps this world look more and more like the kingdom of God here on earth. The question we have to ask ourselves, though, is how do we do that? How do we really do that in a day and age that seems more complex than ever? One that when we turn on the news, it seems like heartbreak after heartbreak. And a day and age where it feels as though our institutions don't have the answers that perhaps we once thought they did. These things start to break our hearts over and over again. And so we have to say, how can we actually make a difference in this world with our life? Well, we are not alone in feeling that way. Thankfully, we can look back over the future and past of Christianity to see how other people who in times of change have actually stepped boldly into those moments. If anybody here has read Phyllis Tickle's really great book, The Great Emergence, has anybody read that book? You can see some hands are great. Highly recommend it. Please go ahead and pick up that book. Phyllis Tickle, along with many other people, have looked at the hypothesis that the way human beings evolve tends to happen in 500-year chunks. 500-year chunks. And you can kind of see that when you look over, let's say, the history of Christianity. From about the time of Malachi, the last prophet we have, until the time of Jesus, it's about 500 years. Then from Jesus and the time of the apostles, we go another 500 years, and then we see the rise of the desert mothers and fathers. And I'll say a word about them in a moment. We're coming back to them. From there, we have about another 500 years till we have Benedict. Then we have Francis. Then we have Julian of Norwich. We have all these inflection points. And you know what was about 500 years ago? The Reformation. The Reformation. Almost exactly, like 500 change at this point. What the people who posit this theory say is that at the beginning of those 500-year cycles, the sorts of prayers and the sorts of mindset and spirit that tends to arise can be considered wisdom schools. That's kind of the term they use. People and individuals who want to take the seed of what the Spirit has done in the story of God and God's people, plant it anew, and watch something grow in its place. And what is equally important about this theory is, since we are very much at the beginning of one, and boy, aren't we seeing things shift? Don't we feel that major shift in this world with COVID, with technology, with all the things that seem to be outpacing the human ability to evolve alongside of it? With all these things happening, the seeds we spiritually plant right now are going to shape Christianity for the next 500 years. Think about that. You're all like Martin Luther right now. You're like Cranmer, right? You're all helping Christianity to evolve into what God is doing next with us. Isn't that exciting? I find that very hopeful, in fact, because yes, we can look at the state of the world and the church and perhaps get really forlorn and say, it's not what it once was. We don't have the numbers perhaps we once had. etc. That's one part of the story, but what we are forgetting is that we're a resurrection people. Anything that God is letting go foul or anything that might look like death will be transformed by that power of the resurrection. When Paul talks about the work of Jesus in the resurrection, he uses the metaphor of the seed. He says the seed goes into the ground and mysteriously blooms again. It dies and blooms. We're still using that metaphor today for the way resurrection works. So for us who are planting these seeds right along with the Spirit, we have to remember that we must plant seeds that are intentional, that we have spent time cultivating, and that ones that we want to help grow not just for ourselves, but the future generations of Christians in the next 500 years. We're planting seeds for trees we won't sit under. That's brave and holy work, isn't it? But here's the problem. For those of us who spend a lot of time in prayer and activity and meditation, all of that's beautiful, but it tills the soil, doesn't it? And whatever seeds you plant in there are going to flourish. So if you plant seeds of joy and peace, wonderful. They're going to flourish because you've tilled up the soil and the ground is good and hardy. If you plant seeds of jealousy and anxiety and pain and remorse, they're also going to flourish, aren't they? Because that ground, it's not distinguishing about which seeds it's going to help grow. So for those of us who are here today to look at a topic like a rule of life, which I promise I'm going to explain what that is in a moment, I promise. For those of us who are here for something like that, we're the sort who can cause great change to happen for our beloved Christianity in our own lives and in our communities. And we also have to be especially attentive and mindful to what seeds we plant in a moment like this, because it's just that fertile a moment. Ooh, heaven is upon us. It's a good moment. So,
well timed, yeah.
Okay, there we go. All right.
That was planned.
Is it Jesus? Is he calling? Yes, well, we answer. That's the right question. So, enter in a rule of life. Remember I mentioned the Desert Fathers and Benedict, etc. A rule of life comes along for these wisdom school teachers, you might say, as a way of organizing their life so that virtues flourish, that who God has created them to be flourishes, rather than just the stuff that we might want to flourish in our own life. Because it's all too easy for us to say, well, yes, I'd like God's will to be done in my life. Well, I don't mind being God's advisory council while I'm at it. God's taking suggestions today. I've got a few for God. So how do we actually let these moments, these pregnant and poignant moments, actually put God's will into the soil? What they have tended to do is form what are known as rules of life. A rule of life, from the word regalia, which is a feminine word in Latin, which means to help grow. It's almost like ruler, or another good word for it would be trellis. It's not the perhaps pejorative word we might hear when we hear rule. Right? Very few of us love a rule enforced upon us. Right? At least I don't. I'm too much of a liberal to, I guess, want too many rules on me. Right? But what we find with a rule of life is instead of it being harsh, it is indeed something that helps us grow. It's like a line for us to know how to grow up. And the reason I keep using a trellis as an example, a plant that is really tended to and has something to grow up and support it actually produces more fruit, more beautiful flowers, right? Think of like a morning glory or a tomato plant. You actually need something for it to grow up. So what they would start to do, and I'm going to read a quote here, is that they started to create these community rules of life to help them live in this way. And that's true even of the desert mothers and fathers who we tend to think of as these wonderful people who lived in isolation out in the desert. They actually had quite a vibrant community together. They weren't as isolated as we tend to think. So I'd love to read this quote to you. The first example of a Christian rule of life came from the desert fathers and mothers, a monastic community of mystics living in Egypt around the 3rd century. The most well-known rule then came later, with St. Benedict, written about 1,500 years ago, and which was created to help his community of monks translate their faith into habits and rhythms of their shared daily life. His famous rule was inspired and has inspired many communities and individuals to develop their own simple intentions. And this comes from the prologue of St. Benedict's rule. It says, Is there alone anyone here who yearns for life and desire to see good days? Then live by this rule. Live by this rule. You can still read Benedict's rule to this day. Each one of them is a little surprising. They're the ones you might expect, daily prayer, living together in community, making sure you take the sacrament regularly, all those things you'd expect. But most of them are rules of hospitality. If a stranger shows up amongst you, welcome that person as Jesus. Live in such a way as though you pray without ceasing, ora et labora, as Benedict would say about that. Prayer and work, ora et labora. You start to see how their lives are carved out together, and their rule becomes almost their heartbeat of how they will be with one another. It's actually far from being kind of pejorative. It's liberating, it's beautiful, and it's, I think, life-giving. Has anybody lived with a rule of life themselves, or read Benedict's, for example? I'm seeing some hands. Great, excellent. Would you like to say, just kind of popcorn, what it does for you, your rule of life?
Stabilizes.
Stabilize, that's a great word. It does. And then, man, I need stabilization in my life right now. How about everybody else? Right? Yes. Others?
For foundation focus.
Beautiful.
A peace to go ahead.
A peace to go ahead, right? If you reflected every day on how you're going to live beforehand, there is a comfort to it. I think about those people who eliminate decision fatigue by wearing the same sorts of clothes every day, right? Now, maybe your rule of life won't include that, but there is something about saying, okay, I know every day how I'm going to wake up, and I'm going to pray. It just takes the decision out of it, right? You just get up and start going for it. Yeah. Others? Yes, please.
More appreciative.
More appreciative. It's a gratitude practice, isn't it? Yeah.
Brings out the best of oneself.
Brings out the best of oneself. Fantastic. I love this. Please.
Provides space for discernment.
Oof. Provides space for discernment. That's a great one. Absolutely right. Yes, please.
Keeps honest communication with God.
Keeps honest communication with God, right? It's if you're showing up to an appointment with God every day, God's going to show up. Let's see if we will, right? That becomes the honesty piece. It's an accountability, right? Beautiful. And for those of us who are daughters of the King as well, I find that a rule of life that is kept in community, for those of you who have one together, there's a bonding agent to it, isn't it? Right? You know that your fellow daughters are praying with you at the same time, maybe all over the world, in fact. There's a cosmic, mystical quality to that, absolutely. So all of that is well and good, but that's what it is, but what isn't it? Because sometimes I think it kind of gets lumped together with a lot of different things that people want to put into it. A rule of life is not like a checklist of everything you ever thought you wanted to get done in your spiritual life. It's not this holy, like, okay, today I'm going to start my marathon with Jesus. It's not like that, right? In fact, when people start either updating their rule life or writing a new one from scratch, the biggest advice I always tend to give is try not to put too much on it right away. Right? It's better to add rather than to start with all these different things that might discourage you after too long, right? So it's the great one piece of advice for a rule of life is pray the prayer you can, not the prayer you can't. Right? And here's another thing I mean by that. The style of prayer that each one of us feels most called to, it might take us a while to really figure that out, and sometimes it changes over our life as well. And we tend to think of it as a personal, individual thing. forgetting the communal nature of prayer that has been passed down to us by our ancestors. Here's what I mean by that. I'm really blessed to be a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa. My grandpa was born on a reservation, and I recently was up there for a very important birthday. I won't say which one it was, which age it was, to do a vision quest with them, and it's incredible. They're a very deeply spiritual group. And one of the things I've learned from my tribe is the concept of blood memory. Blood memory. In indigenous wisdom, blood memory is the term they use to describe the things that are passed down to you from your ancestors that go beyond just the color of your hair and how tall you might be, etc. And this is true even for those of us who are perhaps adopted or don't know our actual ancestors, because in this Native American understanding, it's not just your blood relatives. Blood memory, even though they're using that word blood, actually is a cosmic way of thinking it. Right? People who have influenced you in your life, somebody who taught you to pray, somebody who gave you your first Bible, somebody who helped you in a time of great need, right? They are also your spiritual ancestors as well. Science is beginning to catch up with this, by the way. Have any of you heard of epigenetics or intergenerational trauma? Yeah, a lot of people, right? Yeah, it's kind of very big in the psychological news world right now. It's having a moment. Intergenerational trauma is summed up like this. If your great-grandmother had or your grandmother, I should say, had some sort of terrible trauma happen to her in her life, she actually has a very fascinating change in her DNA. And this is the part I find really amazing. The telemarkers that actually start to pass down DNA and affect the way the hormones are regulated in the body, the health of our organs, etc., that begins to change with trauma. There's a really great book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it talks about trauma, and this is how it works. The body literally does change when something happens. Fascinatingly beyond that, what they've been able to study is that it doesn't just change your grandmother, it changes the DNA patterns of you, your mother, and you, for at least 3 generations. Isn't that fascinating? And it's not to leave us hopeless. Don't worry, I'm going to give us an alternative view in a moment. But what it does mean is that for those who have inherited intergenerational trauma, you might be more likely to deep depressions. You might be more likely to PTSD symptoms, right? And the way your hormones are regulated, the way your body works might change as well. Fascinating, no? Really quite fascinating. So again, this was indigenous wisdom, although the indigenous people will tell you it's actually 7 generations. That the way you live and what happens in your life has been handed down to you from 7 generations, and you will be influencing 7 generations beyond you. And remember what I was saying just a minute ago about those 500-year markers? Again, the indigenous wisdom here is kind of profound, isn't it? The modern science is stacked up against the indigenous wisdom. It's quite beautiful. But here's where they haven't caught up yet, and where I'm sure they will eventually. Trauma, sadly, is easier to study than joy. And so they're making a lot of studies right now based on tracking trauma. You can say, this terrible thing happened to me in my life, and things were changed from there. Right? It's a lot harder to say, this amazing joyful thing happened in my life, and things were changed from there. Right? Joy tends to be more of a pattern of things. Right? And this is where the wisdom continues. What they are finding more and more are that certain virtues and joys actually also change the body on a cellular level. So something like gratitude, for example. Gratitude can change the way the cells function. It actually, they're finding it changes the cellular patterns of hormonal regulations. So you produce more things like serotonin and like the happy hormones, let's say, right? The connective hormones that help us be connected with one another. It goes beyond that. It can actually, a strong gratitude practice can actually change the way organs work in the body. Heart health increases. People tend to have less insomnia and sleep better when they're practicing gratitude. Their stress is reduced. Have I convinced you yet? I mean, that's a good enough list alone, but it continues, right? You know, like the heart, all of these things just keep growing and growing. And it's a practice you can engage in. Like, we often tend to think, oh, happy people are just born that way. No, they're happy because they're practicing great gratitude. They're not grateful because they're happy. They're happy because they're grateful, in other words. So look at those two things together. Yeah, intergenerational trauma, yes. Intergenerational joy, yes. Right? So when you are looking to develop your own rule of life, don't forget your own blood memory. Not just the stuff that might be hard for you, that you might want to seek some healing for, because a good rule of life leaves space for healing and says, you know, I might need a good therapist in my rule of life. I might need a good spiritual director. But it also intentionally leaves room for cultivating joy and gratitude. And I say cultivating, and I mean that seriously. When we spend time mindfully thinking about these things, we start to change the way the brain functions. Sorry to throw a lot of science at you this morning, but I think it's so important for a rule of life. Because we're talking about a pattern, right? A rule of life helps you build a pattern. And the brain loves patterns. Sometimes this is good, and sometimes this is really bad. The brain's job is not to keep you happy. The brain's job is to keep you alive. Thank you, brain. We appreciate that. Thank you. We have needed that. We wouldn't be here today without that functioning. But we mean this even in an evolutionary sense. The way the brain is programmed and wired is to say, if a threat comes at you, it's going to immediately make you make a decision without even rationally making that decision. By surging your cortisol, surging your adrenaline, and putting you into what's known as fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? We all know this, right? It takes the energies from our youngest part of our brain, the frontal lobe, which is associated with things like ration and calmness and regulation of emotions. It sucks that energy right away and puts it into the base of our brain, the mammalian part. Some people call this lizard brain. And it tells us, run as fast as you can. Freeze if there's a threat coming at you. Fight back. Right? All of that makes perfect sense if there's a bear coming at you. You know, that's good. I don't need to stop and ask, I wonder what the bear's motivation is. It's like, you know, hurt bears, right? You know, I don't think it's quite like that. You know, you don't have time. You got to make a decision. But in our modern life, most of what we are responding to are not actual existential threats happening to us in the moment. They're the threats that are happening in our mind, or that we're digesting through media, or, you know, what have you, that are pushing those cortisol buttons all the time. This is why advertising works so well, because it pushes you to say, I need to make a change. I'm afraid I'm not young enough, or fast enough, or rich enough. It hits that fear button, and suddenly you're going to buy something to try to help you solve the problem. A rule of life helps you be less susceptible to that kind of not only advertisement, but helps to retrain your brain. Because in that first 90 seconds, when you're being sent into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and there's also a fourth, by the way, side note, fawn, F-A-W-N. This is when you go towards the threat to try to placate it. It's the favorite of those of us who are codependent, by the way. Side note. Whatever happens in that first 90 minutes, 90 seconds, with all that rush of adrenaline, etc., you kind of have to just live with it for 90 seconds. Your body doesn't let you override that because your brain's job is to keep you alive. And it starts to send you down a neural pathway in your own brain that is going to, let's say you're running, it's going to say keep you running for those 90 seconds. And that's like an eternity, right? When you are feeling that rush of emotion, 90 seconds might as well be 90 years. It's so intense. But if you have a good rule of life, where you have practiced what it is to be mindful in these moments, to be practicing, let's say, breath work as part of your rule of life, or practicing prayer, or practicing disconnecting from those moments, at the end of 90 seconds, you actually get to make a choice. Did you know that? That's what I find fascinating. You don't have to follow the same neural pathway that you've been following. You can actually take a breath and through hard mindful work, choose a new neural cortex or neural pathway. That's the brain's neuroplasticity, the changing of the brain. You practice this every day on your prayer cushion or on your prayer mat, however you pray, building those new neural pathways so that when those 90 seconds are over, you aren't just going down the same road of anxiety that you've been going down at the beginning. Isn't that fascinating? Isn't that fascinating? Yeah. I'm going to pause here for a moment. Thoughts about any of this? Questions? I know I just do a lot of science at you, so I'm going to pause for a minute. So far, so good? I'm not boring them, am I, Terry? Okay.
You're good.
Terry is here to tell me if I'm boring. Okay. So what it is a way of learning how to train your brain towards focusing towards alleluia, 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 even in the face of death, of fear, of pain. This is exactly what our Christian tradition says. It's why even in the burial rites we make our song, alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. And so we are asking ourselves to train ourselves in this role of life. And it starts by saying, what have I been given from my ancestors that I don't want to neglect because it might be the easiest way to pray for me? And what part of my ancestors' gifts do I need to heal from as well? So that my rule of life will start to change those who will look at me as an ancestor, who will look at me as somebody 7 generations ago who helped lay the foundation for the joy that is now. So a good question to ask yourself as you're starting to either form your own rule of life or refresh it, which we can do today, is to ask yourself some things like, what do I hope people will say about me at my funeral? It might be a morbid question, but actually it can be a very joyful question. Right? What do I hope those who are coming after me will say about me? What do I know about the spiritual practices of my ancestors? You maybe do not know a lot, but we live in this moment where you can get even those 23andMe, that you can find out more about your ancestral heritage than you ever could before. It's worth doing a little research. Right? If you had a grandmother who was particularly strong in her faith, what did she do every day to help her be that way? If you had a grandfather who loved to sing hymns all the time, have you added a hymn to your rule of life every now and again? Just see what it does. You may be really surprised. This is one of the reasons that brought me back up to my tribe in Michigan. My grandfather, like many people who were born in his generation, was told by my great-grandmother and their family to try to pass as white as much as possible, to try to not have their rituals, he had to cut his hair very short, because they lived very close to the Canadian border, and they were worried he was going to be taken to one of the residential schools. So he had to abandon all of his rituals. And now part of what I'm hoping to do in my life is to learn these rituals again. And boy, the first time I went up to the tribe and started praying alongside them, I found I knew exactly what to do without ever being told. It was strange. It was one of those things where I'm like, this feels like coming home in a way I had no idea, right? Likewise, the other side of my heritage is Irish, which is why I look like this. My dad's a little leprechaun, so. And so I also did a blood memory trip back to Ireland. And what I found, surprisingly, I went to a place called Clonmacnoise. If you've ever been to Ireland, please go. It's right on the Shannon River. It's one of the oldest monastic sites in Ireland. Have you been? It's gorgeous. Yes, right? Isn't it gorgeous? Beautiful. And without having known this, I almost skipped this part of the trip actually, because I was just running short on time. I stepped on this field on Clonmacnoise, and there is a small building listed on their map called Temple Dowling. My maiden name is Dowling. I had no idea, so I kind of take my map and I kind of stumble over to this place, And I sat down in this building and just started weeping. That's not normal for me, by the way. I'm not really one of those, like, I'm going to cry in public and just, at the drop of a hat sort of people. And what I remembered hearing was the traditional healer in my tribe saying, when the tears well up, that's the ancestors speaking through you. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, try to find out more about your ancestral prayer life. You might find something in there that you never expected. And also, as you're thinking about this rule of life, what habits and patterns do you want to sustain yourself as you're trying to do the same thing for those who come after you? Right? I'm going to pause there again. Thoughts on this? Has anybody had something like this happen in their own ancestral life? Please, yes.
So I'm like all different Northern European, but I went to Germany when I was about 22, just like on a big whirlwind trip of Western Europe. But we were in the Black Forest, and there was a stream, and I just was like, I don't know, I was so connected to that. And also in our exercise with the prayer, I was at a stream in like a little house in the forest. So I don't know enough about my past, but that you saying that brought that up, how I just felt so connected to that particular place.
That's amazing. That's your icon, right? Like, thank you for saying that. That is your icon. And this is why that walk to the future becomes such an important thing, because, this is that fine line we walk in Christianity, especially as Episcopalians. Yes, we believe in science and ration and all that, and that's fantastic. We need all of that. And we also have one foot firmly planted in the realm of mystery and wonder in our life. And we know there are things we can't explain. And so the great communion of saints talk to us through our blood memory, right? Like, this is one of the ways they show up for us in these sorts of ways. So whatever that means to you, it doesn't even have to rationally make sense, but that's now your icon, at least for today. Like, you're building a life that looks like that. And for all of us who've had that vision today, any sort of vision, even if it's just a word, hold on to that for the day, because that's what you're trying to build your life to feel like. How can you build your life to feel more joyful? How can you build your life to feel more peace, etc.? And I hope that's what you saw in your vision. Now, this way, I'd love for you to turn to your leaf, your beautiful folder. Thank you, Olivia, for putting these together. Olivia and T. This is great. Now, what you're going to notice in this folder is that they've put together all sorts of tools that you can experiment with during the rule of life. We've got things like finger labyrinths in here. We've got this beautiful journal. Just a huge again word of thanks for everybody who put that together. Isn't that lovely? Yeah, this is really, yeah. Let's do it all. So good, just so good. Now, a rule of life asks you not only to just to focus on your spirituality, but to figure out like your entire 360 view of dedicating your whole life to God. So I'd love for you to take out this handout that says List of Values, and then this colorful handout, 10 Guideposts for Wholehearted Living. I am really blessed to have been trained by Dr. Brene Brown and her team. Many of you know Brene Brown. She's right there. I know, right? Good stuff. You might not have noticed she's a good Episcopalian. Oh, you did? Okay. That's great. I can't get anything by you. This is good. She is, the way I met her and her team was the Diocese of Texas invited her, and it was the bishop there, knew her, she was a member of their cathedral. And invited her to give their clergy training on becoming dairy way facilitators, so people who are able to bring her work to the world. I begged Bishop Doyle to let me come along, so he did, because I was like, I can't miss this, please. And so I'm lucky to be able to work with her team and the dairy way facilitator. So these two things, the reason I mention that is because these come from Brene Brown's work. In particular, this first one, the list of values. This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the mind. What this is instead is a list of values to get you start thinking about what your actual values are. In your time later, when you're going to be kind of going into building or redoing your rule of life, I'd love for you to pick 2 or 3. I know that sounds incredibly difficult when you look at a list like this. There's so many you could pick. How do you pick just 2 or 3? Well, think of these not just as the values, but the virtues you want to be cultivating with your rule of life, right? And ask yourself the really honest question, which 2 or 3 of these do I actually live? Not just which ones are aspirational. Here's why, right? I can tell you that one of my aspirational values is living a good Sabbath mindset, right? You know, I'd like to be able to tell you I take a really strong Sabbath every week, and I do often. However, if I'm being honest with you all, I can't tell you that that's one of the values that if you looked at my life, you would be able to say, clearly, she's got a good Sabbath mindset, right? That's more of an aspirational value, one that I am learning to live into, but one that I'm not doing super well. It's probably the commandment I break the most, sadly, right? But it is a commandment, so it's there to help me kind of figure out what I might need to add to my rule of life. But I know that it's going to be something like a stretch for me, rather than the prayer that comes easiest for me, or the virtue that comes easiest for me. So you're going to take some time with this in your time to work on this, and pick 2 or 3, and make that part of your icon, right? That vision that we did when we walked to the future. Write down what you saw in that icon, and then talk about to yourself in your mind, what were those virtues that helped me get there? What were the values that were displayed in that icon that I want to foster more of? Because you want to keep building towards your strength. I'm doing this class right now, the certificate with the University of Penn on positive psychology. And I'm learning so much from there that it surprises me. One of them is they do a lot of work on virtue building. And what they say is typically what we've been taught to do in the West is to say, oh, where is your lack, your virtue lack? You know, and do better on that. You know, try to see where you're not doing well and build up there. They actually say that's pretty counterintuitive to how it should go. You should actually go towards your values that are already your strength. Figure out how to do more of those, because the world actually needs those. Those are probably your charisms that the Spirit has given you. And then as you do that, those values that perhaps are not the strongest actually strengthen. Right? It's kind of like the water raises the boats, the tide raises all the boats. So we'll come back to that a little bit, but hold that in front of you as you try to figure out your values and virtues. The second one, this guidepost for wholehearted living, it's that colorful, almost flower one. So Renee chose this very important phrase, wholeheartedness. She tells the story of this comes from her research, so she's a great researcher of human behavior and things like vulnerability and shame and empathy. She always says the stuff on shame and vulnerability does not make her a hit at parties. But what she says is that those people who are living courageously, those who are able to step in and live like full lives trying to give of themselves to the world, which as baptized Christians, that's our call. Especially those who follow the most vulnerable vision of God the world has ever seen. Jesus who comes as first a baby and then dies on a cross. We follow a vulnerable God who shows us that that's who we should be. She calls those people wholehearted. And she says in her research what she had hoped to find was that those sorts of people had been able to engineer their life so they took all of the worry and fear out of it. She goes, absolutely not. None of us, the research shows, actually gets to engineer the scariness or vulnerability out of our life. But what we can do is cultivate wholeheartedness, which that word came to her when she was at a Eucharist one day, and at the Sursum Corda, when the priest says, lift up your hearts, we lift them up to the Lord. She's like, that's it, whole heart up to the Lord. She doesn't say that in her book, but I just wanted to give you that as Episcopalian. So I kind of nerd out about that. I'm like, ooh, Sursum Corda living, I love that. And what you see on the left-hand side, these are things we might want to let go of that she found in the research, things like numbing. Right? These are the patterns and habits of our life that help us check out or self-medicate, right? Or not live fully as ourselves. Things like perfectionism, which is not the same as healthy striving. Perfectionism is not the same as healthy striving. Instead, you might think of it as a demon that just won't let go. Letting go of what people think, things like this, right? Everything on the left-hand side. In your rule of life, this is the space, when I said before, leave room for healing. These are the things we want to heal from, so that we can cultivate what I hope you saw in your walk to the future. Things like authenticity, self-compassion, a resilient spirit, gratitude and joy, intuition, trusting faith, creativity, play, and rest. How often as adults are we not encouraged to play? Right? How often in this late stage capitalism are we not encouraged to rest because productivity is what we're for, right? Calm and stillness, meaningful work, laughter and dance. These are the things that we want our rule of life to help us do more of. And it might mean that as you develop your rule of life, you have to start saying, where are those areas where I'm not living as the cultivated side, but I'm living as the hard side of myself, the side that's not willing to start letting this go. This is why you have to also think about things like your finances, think about your habits, think about the people you live with. Another thing the rule of life is not. It's not a mandate for everybody else in your household if they don't want to sign it. I'll give you an example. So my very first rule of life, remember how I said, don't put everything on this list that you're like, everything I ever wanted to do with God, I'm going to put on this list. Well, I thought this would be a great time to start becoming a minimalist, because I thought, well, I don't want to have too much stuff, I want to live more like the saints, et cetera, et cetera. At the time, I had a 6-month-old baby, and if you know anything about babies, they come with a lot of stuff. They have all sorts of accoutrements that they travel everywhere. And I have a lovely husband, but he's a collector. Yeah, okay, all right, we know each other, right? Yeah.
I'm sorry, Hillary, I live with one of those too.
You know what I'm talking about, And if you are a collector, no shame. I'm just saying, his collection is the sort that takes over many rooms of the house, and it's growing. And
you mean the rooms of the house?
Yeah, plural, all of the rooms.
Oh,
of the
yes.
house. Exactly. His collection is the house. I'll put it that way.
Yes.
And so what ends up happening is here I come with my shiny new rule of life, right? And we're going to live as minimalists in this household.
Uh-oh.
It went terribly within 10 minutes, right? Because suddenly here I am. It sounds like I'm judging him. Maybe I was. Where did the diaper bag go? Oh, I threw that out and I donated it. I didn't think we needed 2. And he's like, well, I kept 1 in the car. And so etc., right? That's a rule of life that you're trying to shoehorn for everybody else, and wasn't even possible for myself in that stage of life. So that's also what it's not. It's not for everybody else in your house. However, for those of you who are daughters of the King, this is one of the beautiful things about having other daughters of the King following a similar rule of life, if that is the charism of your group. Because it may not be the people you live with who can help support you in this, but it can be the people you pray with. Sure can, absolutely. Even if you're an individual who is working on a rule of life, find yourself an accountability buddy, right? Accountability buddy. So that you have somebody who's checking in with you, who's saying, hey, that experiment you were trying, how's it going? It matters because, and maybe most importantly, have them pray for you. Because as you're trying something new like this, it is like anything. If you go to the gym, your muscles might start to get sore from using them, and you might start putting those weights back down and saying, nuts to this. But it's actually the thing that shows that it's working. That might happen with the rule of life at first. You might chafe a little bit. Let's use a financial example. Let's say you've looked at your time, talent, and treasure, and you say to yourself, I have a lot of anxiety around how much money I'm spending every month. And you get serious with yourself and you say, I bet at least a chunk of this money is because I'm self-medicating by going on Amazon when I'm feeling anxious and just buying stuff. Now, that's a good bit of awareness, but it's really hard to stop doing when it's actually been feeding your brain those kinds of you saved yourself in this moment, right? So feel that shake for a little bit. Maybe it's enough to be aware of it for the first week. Maybe then the next week you reach out to your spiritual director or your friend or your therapist, right? This is what I mean. A rule of life is never a static document. It's something that's helping you grow up that trellis. Any thoughts or questions about these two pieces of paper? Because they're gonna be with us throughout this entire day too.
I find it really interesting that what people think perfectionism and numbing and powerlessness is a triad that just goes together.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
Because when you're worried about what people think, or when you're a perfectionist, you worry about what people think, which leads you to be numb and powerless.
So well said. Because perfectionism is not, as I said, healthy striving. Instead, what Brene always says is, it's actually what will they think about me. That's actually what perfectionism is. And then that's a snowball effect. And then what ends up happening is, let's say, you know, this perfectionism has you, and it really has you in your grip. Then you do poorly perhaps on something, or not the 100% way that you wanted on it. What ends up happening is you don't say to yourself, okay, I'm just a human being. Maybe I need to have some self-compassion. Instead, shame kicks in, and what you say is, actually, I'll do better next time. I'm going to keep working until I actually am good enough. Because what shame says is, it's not that I've done something wrong, it says that I am something wrong. You know, and that's why a rule of life helps us grow in compassion and empathy for ourselves and for others. It's really hard to sit with God every day and struggle in the midst of your own stuff and not start to eventually feel a little bit of self-love. Right? Because God loves you so much. And so to sit in the presence of the greatest love anybody has ever known eventually starts to wear off on us. And we want that. We want that. Okay, just a few more things about a rule of life before we head into our break. One thing that a rule of life helps us do is to help make God the center rather than ourselves. And so in your vision, that icon, where was God? Where was God? Normally, God tends to be in the center of these things. Right? If we see a lot more peace, it tends to be because God was there. If we see our churches or communities flourishing, it's because God was there. Right? So where was God? And if not, if there was a part of your vision to the future that concerns you, maybe God was off to the center. Maybe God wasn't so much there. Right? So, or maybe that's your current reality. How can you help bring God back to the center? It also helps us kind of remember that we need to take a look at all of our lives and ask where God isn't in the center of it. That's true of our study, our self-care, our outreach endeavors. Sometimes we're doing those outreach endeavors for ourselves and not for God, which is, good work is still being done, but is God in the center of it? Right? What makes it a difference between just doing something as a social organization rather than as a church, right? As an example. Your prayer, your work, all these things. Where is God? So with all of that in mind, the rest of our day is going to be actually doing this work instead of just talking about this work. We're going to actually spend time together creating a rule of life that's always a first draft. Even if you have one that is 25 years old, 40 years old, whatever, it's still a first draft, isn't it? Right? It's always evolving, always evolving. Ask yourself those sorts of questions. We've already started, and as we do, you're going to have this last piece of paper, this little handy-dandy guide to guide you, which I'm going to walk you through later in the day in our How to Write a Rule of Life section. But notice what's on there. Under the Review Your Priorities space, you have time, trust, temple, and treasure. I borrowed those from Stephen A. Macchia's book on crafting a rule of life. And it tells you some very good indicators of where you want to start chewing this over. Time is, of course, those spiritual practices, the time that you are spending with God. Trust, your relationship priorities. Even though you're not building a rule of life for anybody else, you still have to be mindful of the people in your life as you're building them. Right? So if your rule of life, let's say you live with other people, you might say, I want to be the best cohabitator in the world, and that's perfectionism because you won't be in the world.
Yeah.
So take it down a notch and say, how can I be a loving one? right? How can I be a compassionate one, right? How can I foster that? Temple. This is the physical temple that you live in. Remember, Paul calls the body the temple of the Spirit. Also, the ecological temple. I added that one. That's why it's in parentheses. You know, this beautiful piece of creation is part of heaven. In the book of Revelation, God is heard saying, "Behold, I make all things new." Not, "I make all new things." The Greek is very clear on that, as a matter of fact, because what ends up happening in that vision is that heaven and earth come together as one. And so this creation, it's not like we just leave it, it's actually heaven itself. Are we taking care of it as though it's heaven? I would suggest not. And I would say each one of us on this planet has a way that we could help foster that even more, the temple of God here on earth. So how is that a part of your rule of life? Treasure. These are your financial priorities, and then talent, your missional priorities. Sometimes we get the sense that all of this is kind of navel-gazing, like it's good for us, but what does it do to change the world? Quite the opposite, as you know. The people of prayer that you know tend to be the ones who are out there at the soup kitchens helping out. They tend to be there, doing all the drives for everybody, things like this today, beautifully setting up this gorgeous facility today. Right? That's because they aren't so burnt out because they've been spending time in prayer, that they can actually keep going. Compassion fatigue is a real thing. Compassion, and the only way to keep going, to try to make this world a better place that we all want to, is to be sitting next to that steady stream of the well of life, so that our wells don't run dry. If we don't do that every day, then this world's going to get us. It's going to get us every time we turn on the news. It's going to get us every time we pick up the phone and somebody we love is in pain. This is the only way to actually live into those missional priorities that we want to live into. So that's your overview of a rule of life, and hopefully I've convinced you that it sounds like a good idea. I hope so. And the rest of the day, as I said, is going to be actually doing that. We have just a few more minutes for questions before we go to a break. Or thoughts or comments?
I like the way you use the word trellis instead of rule.
Yeah, it rubs us the wrong way, especially as Americans. Yeah. And that's what the Latin word is much more like. That's why I always mention too, it's a feminine noun, right? When we think rule, we hear like, at least I do, kind of like a male strictness type of thing. It's actually much more mothering and compassionate. Think more like womb space, right? It helps us read. I love it. Do a trellis of life. Yeah, if that language doesn't work for you, I'm not going to tell St. Benedict. That's all right. Change it. Right? Whatever you want. That's fine. I won't tell them. Yeah. Others? All right.
Well, this is it. I go to St. Margaret's. Mother Laura, who's an oblate, is our priest. So we quite often hear about the rule of life.
She's a Benedictine oblate, in fact. Yeah, that's right. Yes. Give her my love, would you?
I should.
I would not be the person I am today without Mother Laura Howe. That is for sure. So, and you're so right.
I will tomorrow.
Thank you. And that's a great example, right? She is not a blood relative of mine, but I consider her a spiritual mother of the faith to me. She is part of my blood memory, and without her, I wouldn't be who I am today. And she taught me so many things about how to pray, how to be a priest. My rule of life is shaped, at least in some part, by her, as well as my mom, as well as my dad, right? Like, but that's how it works, and we want to be that for other people. Yeah. Others? Okay. Well, shall we take a break? Sure. All right, let's do so.
So we're going to be coming back in here.